Hello, and welcome to Thursdays on the Stoop. I'm Julian, one of Blue Stoop's two co-directors, and today we have, looking at the name now, Miracle Workers and Porch Prophets, Myth in Poetry with Michael J. Ivory Jr. Michael's a writer from Miami, Florida, raised by street-side sages, porch-front poets, and offhand oracles. The queer son of two Pentecostal preachers, Michael writes to uncover the magic the church tried to snuff out of him. He has published several times with Miami Press. He holds an MFA from North Carolina State University and currently lives in Philadelphia, PA. So glad you're here. Michael, take it away.
Thank you so much. Shout out to Blue Stoop. I love all of you. Hi, friends. Hi, fellow writers, people who love writing. I'm so happy to be here. I'm kind of screaming because my bio said the son of two Pentecostal preachers, and Foster goes, two? Yes, two. um, my grandmother was head of the motherboard at my church, which if you know what a motherboard is, child, it's deep. All that being said, there's much to explore and we have limited time, so I don't want to take up too much. I'll have a chance to kind of introduce myself, but let's get into it. Welcome everyone to Miracle Workers and Porch Prophets, Myth in Poetry. So first, I feel like every image I use, I want to name the people that I'm using and kind of uh, like acknowledge that I'm using them in this space. On the left, we have Marsha P. Johnson, one of the mothers of the LGBTQ plus movement, queer liberation movement in the United States, but also with ripples globally. Um, and in the vein of miracle workers and porch prophets, Marsha P. Johnson came from a heavily like Christian tradition. And I'm moved, and I learned this recently from Tourmaline, who wrote a biography on Marsha P. Johnson. I'm moved by the idea that she was able to kind of alchemize her Christian upbringing in a way where a God that was given to her as sort of not affirming her existence, she was able to alchemize that God into someone who did affirm her existence and was like a part of the liberatory life that she lived. In the center, of course, we have Harriet Tubman, also known as Moses, right? Already we're bringing myth into the way that she is discussed just by the use of her of the kind of like name Moses. But she also talks a lot about how her faith was a big part of how she was able to free slaves the way that she did, and also the visions that she was granted. Um, that she kind of like associated. Excuse me, I'm gonna close this panel with all your faces for a second so I can see everyone. The visions granted her that allowed her to kind of that gave her a sort of like supernatural insight into how to free, how to lead her people to freedom. And then on the far right, we have Edward Crawford. This is an iconic image that made its rounds in 2014 during the Black Lives Matter protests. Um, Here we see him throwing back a tear gas canister that was thrown at protesters in Ferguson in 2014. And while I don't know anything about Crawford's spiritual or religious background, there is something very heroic and mythic about this image, right? And so we're not just going to talk about the myths that people draw on today, but we're also going to talk about the myths that people make. And there's something about Crawford's, who I believe passed away. Love and rest to his spirit. There's something about Crawford's example, right, that was a sort of animating force for other people who were fighting for the liberation of Black people and peoples globally from police brutality and state-sanctioned violence of all kinds. Um, so, all that being said, the agenda for today, first, I'm going to introduce myself. We got a little bit of an introduction with the bio, but I'm going to give you just a little bit more context of why I'm here doing this. Second, we're going to explore the question of what exactly myth is. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the myths among us. And then finally, we're going to take some time to listen to the poem Ego Tripping by Nikki Giovanni, which relies heavily on myths. And we'll listen to it, and I'll also provide you with a written version of the lines so that you can read along for both accessibility and like close reading purposes. So, first, hi. My name is Michael J. Ivory Jr. As stated before, I'm from Miami, Florida. I lived there for 18 years, raised in the Pentecostal church. And at 18, I left to go to North Carolina for school. I went to Duke for undergrad and North Carolina State for my MFA. And then after 10 years of living in North Carolina, I kind of realized that all of the there are a lot of beautiful things that have been afforded me in North Carolina. As a matter of fact, I see a couple of my friends that I met in North Carolina on this call. Love y'all. But then I got to the point where it was like, I want to do something different. And I decided to move to Philadelphia because my creative spirit felt like it had a home there. As far as my writing training goes, my background first begins with Black people, point blank, period. I am the son of two preachers, and while there is a lot of difficulty and trauma, frankly, wrapped up in that, there's also a lot of power because the writing tradition of the Black preaching tradition has been really instructive to me in how I think about language and the power that it has. Gossipers, right? Growing up in the South, you're going to hear some good gossip, but there's something inherently poetic about the way Southern Black folks speak, and women specifically. On the left, you can see an image of me as a baby, and I'm being held by my mother. And it's interesting because I now wear headscarves in the same way that she is wearing them in this picture. But she is one of the people, right, that taught me about language. Listening to her just talk with my grandmother and with her godmother, it gave me a passion and an endearment toward the power of language. When I was in undergrad, I was a part of a spoken word group called Spoken Verb. And that was where I kind of got introduced to the slam. And it was here that I started to learn a little bit more about the way that Black people, queer people, women, disabled people, all kinds of marginalized folks have sort of like uh, interrupted the canon, but then also started to construct their own canon of like literary and writing prowess. I 3 of the 4 years that I was attending Duke, I attended the College Union Poetry Slam Invitational, also known as CUPSI. And it was a really instructive part of my writing kind of training. And then finally, I got an MFA in fiction from North Carolina State. And it was here that I started to really kind of get clear about the kind of work that I want to do in the writing space. And it was here that I started to reflect on my upbringing in the Pentecostal tradition. And though I have since been doing a lot of reinterrogating of my theological background, one thing I know about Pentecostalism is that the way that it reads the Bible, the way that it interprets the Bible, is heavily rooted in the concept of myth. And so um, I write from a space knowing that the myths that I read in my religious upbringing were made, and therefore I also have the power and the license to make new myths. So when you hear in my bio and I talk about, like porch prophets and offhand oracles, right? It's because I believe that the myths that exist around me in my everyday life are just as significant and powerful and potent as the myths that have been lodged in thousands of years old holy texts. Um, and we're going to explore a little bit of that today. So, um, what is myth, right? Before we move on, I want to point out this image. This is an image from a play called The Half God of Rainfall. It is written by Inua Ellams. I had the pleasure of being able to see it here. Well, not, I had the pleasure of being able to see it in Philadelphia, not physically in Philly right now, but I got to see it in Philly. It is a play that examines patriarchy through the lens of a character who is the son of a priestess of Oshun and the son of the Greek god Zeus. It is a visually stunning play, and I think it exemplifies a lot about how we can both revisit and reinterrogate myth to examine the world today, right? Just because a myth is from an ancient culture does not mean that it doesn't have resonance and ripples with the way that we examine the world presently. So, um, I have this definition here. It's by Jose Manuel Losada, who is a professor of comparative literature, I believe. And the definition here is that myth is a functional, symbolic, and thematic narrative of one or several extraordinary events with a transcendent, sacred, and supernatural referent. That's a lot of words. Um, and I'm going to kind of reword it in a way that I think is useful and accessible to the work that we'll be doing today. So, what I mean to say is that a myth is a story with culturally evocative imagery and themes, usually with some sort of sacred element, maybe supernatural, but maybe not. And I really want to oops, not there. I really want to kind of like note this word sacred because when I'm talking about the sacred here, I'm not inherently trying to invoke the religious. I do think that it's important to note the religious, especially um, we'll talk a little bit about the current political climate. Just want to note that I should have said this earlier. As somebody who lives with a chronic health condition, who depends on access to healthcare, and is also a Black queer person who is navigating a world that is constantly reminding me that Blackness and queerness are not always welcome, if not most times not welcome. um, and the recent, very fresh news around legislation today, I could imagine that folks are bringing into this space, feelings, thoughts, carrying some kinds of emotions. Um, I do want to do a little bit of exploration of the US and its political kind of like makeup and how myth works within that space. However, I do not want to invite anyone to participate more deeply than they are like emotionally prepared for. I hope that this space and kind of navigating this might be cathartic and not re-entrenching sort of like any sort of upset or frustration. But I also want this to be a space of care. So, all that being said, um, when I'm talking about the sacred here, I'm not just talking about the religious. I am talking about white supremacy. I am talking about the patriarchy because while those things are, how would I say, uh, repulsive, they are sacred to the way that U.S. empire works. So, um, noting that, right, when I'm talking about the sacred, I'm talking about the things that we hold dear culturally, socially, and politically, whether they have a religious or supernatural bent or not. um Now, what I don't mean to say, however, is that a myth is a lie, right? And the reason why I'm saying that is because when you come from like I said, I come from the Pentecostal tradition, but one of the things that's very notable about the Pentecostal tradition, particularly as Black people perform it, is that it is a Christian tradition that is deeply syncretized with African traditional religious practices. And even if we are not cognizant of it, the way that we talk about God, and in turn, theologically, the way that that understanding of God informs our understanding of ourselves, is important to be honored in the space. I would not tell somebody that their like cosmology is a lie, right? And there's a caveat to that that I'll get to in a second. But often when we use myth, particularly colloquially, what we're saying is that a myth is a lie. I'm not talking about myths as lies. I am talking about them as stories, however, because what I understand about myth and its significance to our lived reality is that something does not have to be real for it to be true, right? In other words, it does not have to have tangibly existed. It does not have to be scientifically measured for it to still have validity, impact, and value to the way that we move through and understand the world. All that being said, we can and sometimes should reject myth. We do have the license to speak back to myths that are harmful, that do not serve us, that are violent, and Nikki Giovanni is going to show us that in a second. So, another person I'm bringing into the space, Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison leans heavily on myth in her work. I could talk about it a ton, but I also want to make sure that I'm keeping track of time. So, what I will say is that if you've read Beloved, right? One of my favorite stories about Toni Morrison is that when you read Beloved, which is a story about a slave woman or a formerly enslaved woman, a woman who was a slave, and then um, throughout the course of the story, right, we see her kind of like examining her past. And one of the things that she did to kind of like escape or try to escape slavery or the clutches of slavery was to her kill her children. She killed one successfully. She tried to kill another one. And in the journey of the novel, we find that the child that she did kill, the titular beloved, she comes back in the form of a full-grown woman, right? Um, and there's a scene where this woman comes up out of the water, right? And in the documentary, The Pieces I Am, which is a documentary about Toni Morrison's life, she mentions that that scene is actually like autobiographical. She says that she was sitting behind her home and she saw a woman who seemed to have come from nowhere and seemed to be going somewhere she didn't know walk up out of a river in a full dress and a hat fully shrouded. And she wrote verbatim kind of like what she saw coming up out of the river behind her home in the novel. Um, and so myth is significant to Toni Morrison. And she says here, the one thing you say about a myth is that there's some truth in there, no matter how bizarre they may seem, right? So it is, you do not have to take a myth as real and as an embedded part of our reality in a tangible sense to be able to honor the curiosity that may lie therein in terms of like, but what is this myth here to show me, right? And what impact is this myth having on the world, even if I don't believe that the actions taken in the myth actually happened? So let's talk about the myths among us. And this is an opportunity, I think, for us to kind of, I've been doing a little bit of talking, and I want to make some space for us to talk back a little bit. So here we have an image of two women who practice the religion of Santeria. I am from Miami, as I'm probably going to say like 10 more times. Very proud of my hometown. But I've grown up around a lot of Afro-Cuban folks, and Santeria is something that I witnessed practiced in my neighborhood, discussed by my peers. Um, and so, um, yes, this is an image of those women practicing the Afro-Cuban religion that is Santeria, which is another syncretized practice between Catholicism and Afro-traditional spiritual practices. So, myths and us. There are myths in the capital W world. We are about to see somebody we do not like. And then there are myths in our worlds. So with that being said, um, I think we all know who that is on the left. But does anybody have any idea of who that might be on the right? Wait like 10 seconds and see if it pops up in the chat. Cool. All right. Happy to help. So, oops, sorry. On the left, we have, of course, the evil emperor of the United States, the one known as Donald Trump. And this image comes from the day that an assassination attempt was made on him. But the reason why I include him here is because there's something very mythic about this image, right? The way that he has his fist raised, the American flag billowing in the background, it's very clear that this framing, right, is meant to represent like a man almost vanquished but overcoming, right? And the excitement that is supposed to be stirred within the people that follow him or believe in his, in the tenets that he espouses, like kind of saying like he triumphed, right? But also what he represents triumphed too. And I'm using capital W world specifically, and I'll explain that in a second. But on the right, we have the myths in our worlds, right? So this man is named Bishop Charles H. Mason. He is the founding bishop of what is known as the Church of God in Christ, which is one of the largest Christian denominations in the United States. Naturally, if you I guess most of us would be aware that like Christianity generally does not like espouse or honor like the practices of things we consider witchcraft. But what's notable here is that in this image we have this bishop the founding bishop of an incredibly powerful Christian denomination holding roots and herbs. He was a noted root worker. As a matter of fact, people who practice root work, conjure, hoodoo, or other forms of like Black spiritual tradition kind of venerate the spirit of Bishop Charles H. Mason, even if he would not overtly honor their existence, because it was clear that he had an understanding of the syncretized relationship between the ancient spiritual practices of his ancestors and the present religious kind of hegemony that he was stepping into. Um, and so, um, the point of all this is that the myths in the capital W world, right, are the stories that empower the systems, structures, and norms that shape our societies and govern power. And the state knows the power of myth and uses it to animate power, right? So it could look something like an image of George Washington crossing the Delaware, right? And the sort of it's evident that this painting is telling us a story of this heroic figure that is George Washington, right? Whom we know like owned slaves, right? Whom we know, right, is still like a representative of some of like the worst of this country and its history. But in this moment, as we're like telling the story of the origin of this country, right? And the great moments that made this country possible. Here we have a man draped in a cape, right? Standing like taller than everybody else on a boat, like looking out across the water as the sun shines upon him. And you have these men who are clamoring, right, to lend their strength and their hope and their courage to see to it that he is able to fulfill like the birthing of this nation, right? It could look something like images that tell the story of the first Thanksgiving, right? Instead of it being, you know, a slaughter, instead of it being, right, the like one of the earliest moments of like colonization, right, and the genocide of the indigenous people of this land, it was a moment of great peace, right? It was a moment of great sharing, right, between the pure-hearted white Christians, right, and the gentle, perhaps slightly backwards, but still generous of spirit indigenous people. And so Thanksgiving, right, is not a moment, right, where we have to reckon with genocide, but rather it is a moment where we get to say that, oh, being a part of this country is, you know, is a blessing because it was born out of the blessing of community and sharing and whatever else they want to slot into that space. Um, Grammarly, what? Sorry. And then here we have the film Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffiths. It was a film that was screened in the White House. And it is interesting because this film is at the origin story of the Ku Klux Klan. And looking at this image, right, you see this figure like atop a horse. Um, like looking like super like knightly and heroic. Meanwhile, the film is like portraying Black people as beasts and and as dangerous, like dangerous to the purity and the sanctity and the sweetness and softness of white women, and how the Ku Klux Klan is like the delivering force, like kind of saving these damsels from the kind of like foaming at the mouth, bestial like Black folks. But these myths, right, even if we can look at them and see how absurd they are now, they are still like giving animus to the imagination of this country in its most violent forms. And the state, right, benefits from that. Power, right, it is these myths, right, that kind of form the crux, the flesh, the meat of the soft power that continues to kind of endanger us. Um, so, with that being said, I'd like to take a minute to pause here and I've given a few examples, but I'm gonna exit my screen share and ask if you want to drop in the chat, what myths does the state deploy against us? And I'll like lift up maybe like 2 or 3 responses. That their power is inevitable. The Marlboro Man, rugged individualism, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Hard work pays off. Exactly, right? Like there are these myths, right? That that their power is ubiquitous, right? That the reason that their power exists um, is, oh wow, y'all are really giving it to me. Thank you. Like that their power is ubiquitous, right? That there's no way to work around it, that there's no way to escape it, right? They're illegal immigrants ruining this country. That's big, right? Like we have Haitians, right, whose temporary protected status is being revoked, right? And we have protests out in LA, right, as immigrants from Central and South America are being placed under assault by the state, right? We have ICE literally disappearing people off the streets in real time. And these stories that are being told, right, then uphold the notion of what is and is not legal, right? So, what myths allow us to do, right, is to warp the moral in service of the legal, or at least that's what it allows the state to do, right? To warp the moral in service of the legal, because where the moral, right, is about right relationship with ourselves and each other, right, the legal is about the power, right, that governs our relationship to the state and our inability to really challenge the state when it matters. Manifest destiny is an amazing one, right? The idea that God uh, made it so that white folks had to, like, it was God's will for white folks to decide that they were going to kind of conquer this land, take over it, expand west. Um, the goodness and perpetual innocence of whiteness. Yes, Christina Sharp. Absolutely, right? Um, yeah, so I think that I think y'all are on the money with this, right? This is absolute prosperity gospel. Okay, I'm sorry, I have to lift that one up because that was a myth that ruled my life. Sorry, motorcycle went by. That was a myth that ruled my life for a long time. For those of you who may not be aware, um, Chris, do you want to explain what prosperity gospel is, or do you want me to take it away?
I prefer you do it, Michael. I
Before I
think
do
you
it.
probably
Okay.
have more knowledge. Thank you.
Cool, cool, cool. So prosperity gospel, right, is this notion God that God's intentions for Christians are to be wealthy because that wealth, right, is essentially good PR for God. And so, in that vein, it is a sin to be poor because you're giving God a bad name by like showing your poverty off to everybody. The other tenet of prosperity gospel is that um, essentially prosperity comes from faith. So it is a very individualist understanding of spirituality as well, because the idea is that if you are poor, it's because you just didn't believe enough to be rich. And that it was a hugely popular force, especially because it got pumped a lot to disempowered people. It was a really attractive thing to people who felt like they had no other power, right? Because the idea was, oh, if you're struggling right now, it's just because you don't have enough like God and faith to truly understand that like there's actually like all this wealth waiting for you on the other side of just like being more Christian. Um, so yes, and prosperity gospel really sunk its teeth into folks during the 2008 recession. And what's interesting is that I'm seeing it come back around as we find ourselves in a moment that mirrors that time in history. So that's fun. Okay, back to it. So, um, now then there are the myths in our worlds, right? So in our respective families, in our communities, in our lineages, there are myths that guide us, identify us, and empower us, right? So we have the big story about what the world is and how we should aspire to like that world and what is and is not possible. But then we have the myths that kind of counter that by giving us personal stories about who we are, what our place in the world could be, and even in some ways how we might be able to walk away from the world. So there's this first image. This is an image of Mildred Officer. She is um, thank you, Foster. I hope this is, yeah, I'm hoping this is all helpful. So, and yes, Chris, it was a huge part of televangelism, prosperity gospel, that is. So this woman, her name is Mildred Officer. She is being interviewed in Ann Arbor, Michigan, because she's telling the story of how, like, what challenges her parents faced in securing and buying a home in Ann Arbor. And I just chose this image because one, it felt like an appropriate stand-in, I think, for the like quiet myths that like a lot of the Black folks in my life kind of bestowed upon me and helped me kind of understand like what my power was. Because again, as I said, all the critiques I have of Pentecostalism, of Christianity as a whole, of like hegemonic Christianity, imperially aligned in Christianity, all those critiques remain. They still stand. But there is still something I must say about the power of growing up around Black folks who knew how to pray, right? Because praying was not just about, especially the way that my folks did it, it wasn't about begging God, right? It was actually a spiritual means of understanding that you actually can like narrate and articulate the kind of world that should be. Um, and whether or not all of those prayers, in a sense, came true, there was a certain kind of like strength that came from knowing that even if the world was not birthed externally, it was birthed within me because the fact that somebody said it made me understand that it was possible. Um, that being said, does anybody know what this person is doing with this stick? Trying to find water. Yes, dowsing.
Water?
Exactly.
Water, yeah.
Trying to find water, right? So this is a practice known as water witching, water dowsing, which is something that you will find very popular, particularly like in the rural United States. It's very popular in Appalachia. And water witching is not, it's not a skill so much as it's a spiritual gift, right? Stories will say that like you have the gift of being able to sense where water is underground, and you can't teach somebody how to do it, but you can pass that gift to somebody else. And they're like every family or every kind of community has a different understanding of like what the terms are around like accessing that. But the reason why this image is really significant, one, because I have a soft spot in my heart for Appalachian people because of the like history of cultural exchange between like Black folks, Indigenous folks, and Appalachian folks. I also think that like Appalachians like really existed as like a canary in the coal mine in the way that like whiteness was like a trick bag for white folk, like for white folks, and how like they really got thrown under the bus, while also understanding that like there are a lot of Appalachian people, white Appalachian folks, who are still deeply invested in like narratives of white supremacy. But when they are not, I've had some like really wonderful experiences with them. Um, so but I included this image also because when we think about um how we kind of like navigate like access to resources, right? How we navigate knowing the land, right? Our relationship to the land not being arbitrated by an economic system that only sees land as capital, or a political system that only sees land as control, but actually having a sort of intimacy with the land that like interrupts what we think we're here to do. And water witching like is like one of those just small examples, I think, of like how we tell ourselves a story that like the land is more than what we can sell on it or what we can build on it. Um, and then finally, does anybody have an idea what this painting might be of? Hint, hint, this is in Haiti. It's depicting a scene in Haiti. Cool. So this is Bois Caiman, right? Which is the ritual that was said to set off the Haitian Revolution. And so myth plays an incredibly, um, yes, preparing for the revolution. Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Um, Myth plays an incredibly significant and important role in in the story of the Haitian Revolution, because Haitian Vodou, right, was part of not just these like Black folks kind of understanding that like, oh, like we can appeal to spirits, right? But it was also a unifying force, right? And um, I chose to include this image also because there's a recent video that's like still going around, it's very viral, of some Haitian folks like really like tearing up ICE, I think in Brooklyn. Um, especially in the wake of the news around TPS being revoked. And as somebody who has a lot of Haitian friends, I've always been deeply um moved by the spirit of liberation and freedom that they all carry. And for me, right, what I've always taken from them is that that spirit, right, is deeply ancestral and it lies in the story of what empowered them to form the first Black republic in the world. Um, so, before we move forward, I want to stop here because I feel like I'm talking quite quickly and I want to make sure that I haven't zoomed past anything. So is there anything that isn't, we have a like a brief space for pause. So is there anything that isn't quite clear? Anything anybody has questions about? Um, oh, thank you, Foster. Thank you. Um, cool, cool, going once. Yes, Nicole, I see your hand.
Um, could you speak to, I feel like this is a big question, but could you speak to the relationship of like the role of the collective versus the individual in myth making?
Yeah, I mean, so wow, that's a big question. Okay, so the collective, right? There is a knowing, right, that does not happen without me being in community with other people, right? I do not know my queerness, but to know it through the experience of other people's queerness, because it was other people's queerness that makes it possible for me to step into the territories where my queerness becomes evident to me, right? I do not know my Blackness, but to be in community with other Black people because it is other people's expressions of Blackness that give me language for what is possible for me, right? So the collective is incredibly important when it comes to myth making because a myth, right? I mean, I have personal myth, right? I have stories I tell myself about who I am and what the world is to me. But even those myths, right, are being birthed from what other people have shown me, right? What other people have given me as a possibility, and what stories have been passed down. So um, I'll give you an example. Um, my grandmother. So my mother, I'm gonna really try to make this quick, but this is actually a perfect segue into the next section. So I am the son of, well, of my mother, but I'm also I have a sort of like sibling relationship between my mother and I and my grandmother. And the reason for that is because my mother and my grandmother were distant for a significant period of each other's lives. But what happened was when my mother had me, um, she um, she didn't know she was pregnant with me until she was 7 months pregnant. It scared the hell out of her. Um, and she was just, excuse me, so sure that she had like screwed her baby up because she had not been doing the things that pregnant people do when they're preparing for a baby. And so when she had me, she said, like, I was just grateful that you had all your fingers and toes. But when she like did some like she said that some time went by and one night, as babies do, I just wouldn't stop crying, right? And so she freaked out, and the only person she could think to call was the mother, her mother, my grandmother, that she had been distant from for quite some time. My grandmother came back into our lives. We like started this journey together of me getting to know my grandmother, my mom getting to know, her mother anew, and like this whole triangle relationship. And my grandmother, for a long time, she dealt with alcoholism. And so my mom told her, if you want to be in my life and you want to be in my child's life, I'm going to need you to start really putting the work in to like not indulge in alcohol, because I don't want you to pass down to my child what you gave to me, unfortunately. And my grandmother said, um, you're absolutely right. I'm going to get sober. Um, and my mom said, okay, that's great. We'll get you into some meetings and we'll start figuring out like what you need. And she said, no. She said, my mom says that my grandmother handed me to her and said, take this baby. I'm going to go upstairs and I'm going to go in the room. Don't come out of the room don't knock on the door until I come out of the room. My mom says that she sat down on the living room couch, heard my grandmother upstairs, and she was praying, and she prayed all night long. The story, the legend is that, and I've known my grandmother my whole life until she passed. I'd never seen her drink. The story goes that after she prayed for those hours, she came out of the room and she never touched the bottle again. And so there's this story here about within this, right, there are these embedded stories of myth, of what it means to heal, right? How one heals, what possibilities exist within healing. But that's a legendary story for me, right? That's a story that helps me understand like what it means to heal, what it means to like change your life, what it means to like pursue love. Oh, thank you, Tracy. But it's also something that I would not know if I were not in community with her, right? And then also, right, the fact that this was birthed out of a request for accountability, right? So this communal ask for, I need you to change because I want you to be healthy because your health is also the health of my household. So I hope that is at least useful. But yeah, so, okay, we got 14 minutes left and Nikki Giovanni still has something to say to us. So I'm gonna jump back into it. We're gonna skip over one question that I wanted to ask, but it's okay because I think it'll be able to resurface in another place. So I'm going to now play, I'm gonna play this. Oh, and before I do that, because my screen is glitching. Sorry. Before I do that, I want to drop this in the chat for you all because I want y'all to be able to follow. Nikki Giovanni reads her poems very fast. If you need help following along, I've dropped the lines for you in the chat that you can click on and all that good stuff. But with that being said, let's get back to it.
I was born in the Congo. I walked to the Fertile Crescent and built the Sphinx. I designed a pyramid so tough that a star that only glows every 100 years falls into the center, giving divine, perfect light. I am bad. I sat on the throne drinking nectar with Allah. I got hot and sent an ice age to Europe to cool my thirst. My oldest daughter is Nefertiti. The tears from my birth pains created the Nile. I am a beautiful woman. I gazed on the forest and burned out the Sahara Desert. With a packet of goat's meat and a change of clothes, I crossed it in 2 hours. I am a gazelle, so swift, you can't catch me. For a birthday present when he was 3, I gave my son Hannibal an elephant. He gave me Rome for Mother's Day. My strength flows ever on. My son Noah built New Ark, and I stood proudly at the helm as we sailed on a soft summer day. I turned myself into myself and was Jesus. Men intone my loving name. All praises, I am the one who would say. I sowed diamonds in my backyard. My bowels deliver uranium. The filings from my fingernails are semi-precious jewels. On a trip north, I caught a cold and blew my nose, giving oil to the Arab world. I am so hip, even my errors are correct. I sailed west to reach east and had to round off the earth as I went. The hair from my head thinned and gold was laid across 3 continents. I am so perfect, so divine, so ethereal, so surreal. I cannot be comprehended except by my permission. I mean, I can fly like a bird in the sky.
Okay. That poem is one of my favorite poems of all time. But let's get into it. So I'm gonna copy these into the I'm gonna copy these into the chat, but I want to use the last 10 minutes to kind of just have like a little bit of a reaction. So we're not going to answer all these questions in order. I just want these to be guiding questions. The first question is, with the context that this poem was specifically meant to celebrate and uplift Black women, what myths do we see this poem employing, and what purposes are they serving? Second, what images or symbols resonated with you? Why? Three, in the recording, what sounds did you notice besides Nikki's reading? Why do you think that was? And four, has this poem inspired anything for you in your personal myth making? And don't worry, I will drop all those in the chat for you. But I'm just curious with the time that we have left, if anybody has any reactions to the poem with respect to those questions. Yes, Foster.
One thing that really like jumped out for me is like her building this myth and building this myth and building these myths and the sounds surrounding these myths that she's building are reflective of all of the responses that you would hear in the like the biggest Black myth making center, the church. Yeah, I love that mirroring that was happening.
Absolutely. Right. This kind of like call and response that's happening, right? So she's standing somewhere between poet and preacher, right? Except normally what's interesting about the preacher is that the preacher exists to exalt a divinity outside of oneself, right? Particularly how theologically the church like positions us in our relationship to God. But there's something interesting about Nikki Giovanni, a Black queer woman, positioning herself in a sort of pulpit space, at least sonically, and exalting her own divinity. So she's praising herself and being in the center of a room of people who are also affirming said divinity. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Foster. Any other thoughts? Okay, I see Artrice. Did I pronounce your name right, Artrice? Okay. In the recording, I heard shouts from other people / women, which makes me think of Black people expressing emotion through bodily sounds, shouts, hums, moans, etc. And those sounds move spirit. Absolutely, right? So the embodiment, right? The embodiment practice being evidence, right? That sometimes the stories we tell are not rooted just in the words that we write down, right? That there's an understanding that is pre-linguistic, post-linguistic, beyond language. And that too is myth. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yes, Miriam.
What I thought was interesting, beyond the sound and what everybody else was talking about, was like the familiarity with like some of the words. Like Nikki was deconstructing other myths and making them her own. You know, so every time something came up like Noah and the Ark, or phrase that she used, I can't remember hand, but it was like completely deconstructing something, brought home a myth that like I could relate to. You know, so it was like making it personal. And listen.
Absolutely, Miriam. Thank you. Your audio did cut in and out, but I think I caught the gist, so I'm going to say it back. And if I missed anything, feel free to let me know. So you were really kind of like struck by the way that Nikki Giovanni was deconstructing myths, right? By taking them, right, reinterpreting them, reimagining them, in some ways kind of unraveling them, right? And then like almost taking them and turning them into new garments that apply to her, right?
Yeah.
So like taking them from beyond and bringing them home. Um, yes, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, it's one of my favorite parts about, this poem, right? A lot of times, especially when we consider the role that history plays, like history is one big myth, right? Um, and the story that we tell of history, right, especially Africa being often a secondary figure, right, in a lot of these myths, right? The idea that Jesus, right, especially in the United States, is heavily associated with the image of a white man, right? Or a lot of biblical figures being reimagined as white, right? Or Hannibal, right, being associated with imperial prowess, which, I mean, we can critique like the notion of empire, right? But at the same time being saying like there's something to be said about like these things are made possible by Africa, right? So centering Africa and centering like Africa as a Black woman that is able to produce this power. Um, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out, Miriam. Okay. Kaisir says, to answer question 4, this poem inspires me to view my own experience as a queer Black male in America in more of a spiritual perspective, just as identity was tied to the spirit for our ancestors. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I could talk about that ad nauseum, but I feel you. And I mean, here we have it like a queer Black person, Nikki Giovanni, kind of modeling that for us, even though I believe Nikki Giovanni was Mm, I don't want to lie on her, but I believe she was atheist or some form, or like she was not very enticed by the notion of God in the way that like other folks might have been. But she still understood the significance of myth, right? So absolutely. Elena, super struck by the way stigmatized and or dirty aspects of the body and its functions, like tears, birth, the contents of her bowels, her snot, her fingernail clippings, are exalted in this wonderfully subversive way. Yes. Yes, right. Her bowels yielding uranium, right? Like her fingernail clippings being gold or something like that. Her fingernail filings being gold, right? Like, yeah, even the refuse being exalted, right? So, yeah, like doing a whole like turning the world on its head thing. Caitlin, I like the line, I turn myself into myself as two meanings, meaning both Jesus being mythologized as God and child of God, but also the myth making process of forming an identity regular humans go through is a process of turning ourselves into ourselves. Yes, you hit the nail on the head with that, Caitlin, because I turned myself into myself and was Jesus is actually my favorite line in that whole poem. Absolutely, right? Especially when, and again, like subverting, especially the notion of like Christianity hinging on the idea of salvation being something where you have to leave the self behind to encounter the divine, when in fact the true journey is just to yourself. And like her kind of like speaking back to that. Um, yeah, we got 3 minutes left. If there are any other final thoughts or questions, right? If there's something burning that you just like, there's this big hole in this that I don't understand. Do I have any prompts for writing? Oh, wow. You know what? I do. Um, this was the question that I didn't get to ask for the sake of time. But what personal myths guide you? I would encourage you to like take some time to just kind of sit and journal about the myths in your lineages, in your communities, in your ancestries, right? And again, these do not have to be religious, but just like if there's a woman in your history, if there's a person of any gender in your history, I hinge toward women because the women had a huge role in my life. But if there's a person in your personal like history lineage that has like really informed you, shaped you, right? Like sing their story, like sing their veneration, like write an altar for them in a poem. I think that we need that, right? Because it also helps identify you. And the last thing I'll say before I hand it back over is this was a poem that I wasn't necessarily planning on, but I was like, if we just happen to like still have time, I highly recommend that you check out this poem, Karma by Dominique Christina, which is another incredibly powerful poem that employs myth. And I think honestly, it would be really cathartic to listen to that poem today of all days, or honestly every day for as long as this country is what it is. So yeah, I think that's it. Thank y'all so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. What a fabulous session. I know I learned a lot. So it seems like you all did too. I'm gonna give you all a minute to say some thank yous in the chat. And another way you can say thank you is by filling out a feedback survey. Everyone loves paperwork. Well, I do. It's my job. So I'm going to share some links. That first link is the survey. I'm going to email it to you again. So if you can't grab it now, don't worry about it. If you registered for the session, I've got your email address, so I'll reach out. Other links that you'll find there. Summer classes, I mentioned those before, but the first one is next week, next Thursday evening. And that one's on opening pages. So if you're a prose writer, that might be up your alley. And then a little bit later in the month, we've got a class on writing memory, flashback, that kind of thing. We're still working on August classes, but keep an eye out for those. They might be up your alley as well. Upcoming events, we've got Thursdays on the Stoop. We're bi-weekly in the summer, meaning every other week. And then in the fall, we'll go back to our weekly schedule. So 2 weeks from today, we've got a panel of literary translation experts. So if you're interested in that type of work, check the panel out. We've also got so many other things going on this summer. We are staying busy. Happy hours are coming back. So keep an eye out for those. Poetry club is happening at the end of each month. I could keep going, but I'll try and save some time for everything else. Best way to stay on top of all of it is subscribing to the newsletter. It is free. It lands in your inbox. Couldn't be more convenient. No algorithms. They actually we get the information to you without having to fight, I don't know, Meta about it. And last but not least, of course, this was a free session. We are so glad you are here. And if you're in a place in your life where you have a few extra bucks and you want to pitch in to help us continue to deliver free programs like this one, just go to bluestoop.org/donate. It's a really nice way to feel like maybe you're making a small difference in the world. But regardless, we are just glad you're here, glad you're part of this community. And thank you so much again to Michael for just bringing so much good energy into a really challenging week. Appreciate you. With that, enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, y'all.